22 innocent children sat in a room at the Iowa Soldiers and Sailors Orphans home in 1939. Half of them were about to become victims of one of the most twisted psychological experiments in American history. A respected professor was about to deliberately try to make healthy children develop speech problems, not to help them, not to cure stuttering, but to prove his theory was right. And the most disturbing part? He succeeded. By the end of his experiment, children who had never stuttered before were too afraid to speak. This is the story of the monster study and how science became torture. The man behind this nightmare was Wendell Johnson, a professor of speech pathology at the University of Iowa. Johnson himself had a severe stutter, and this personal struggle drove him to become obsessed with understanding why some people stutter and others don't. But his obsession would lead him down a dark path that would destroy young lives. Johnson believed he had cracked the code of stuttering. His theory was called the diagnosogenic theory, and it was revolutionary for the time. He thought stuttering wasn't caused by physical problems or brain defects. Instead, he believed it was learned behavior that developed when children were criticized for normal speech mistakes. According to Johnson, when parents and teachers constantly corrected children's speech, it made them self-conscious and anxious about talking. This anxiety, he claimed, was what actually caused stuttering. Johnson had a famous quote that summed up his entire belief system. Stuttering begins not in the child's mouth, but in the parent's ear. He was convinced that stuttering was created by the way adults reacted to normal childhood speech patterns. The theory made sense on paper, but Johnson needed proof. He needed to show that you could actually create stuttering in normal children by making them anxious about their speech. And that's where the children at the Iowa Soldiers and Sailors Orphans home came in. The orphanage in Davenport, Iowa, was the perfect testing ground. These children had no parents to protect them, no advocates to question what was happening. They were completely powerless and dependent on the adults around them. Johnson saw them as ideal test subjects for his twisted experiment. In January 1939, Johnson sent his graduate student Mary Tudor to the orphanage. Tudor was young, enthusiastic, and completely unprepared for what she was about to do. Her job was to screen hundreds of children to find the perfect subjects for Johnson's experiment. Tudor examined 256 children at the orphanage. She was looking for two specific types of kids. First, she needed children who already had stuttering problems. But more importantly, she needed children who spoke perfectly normally. These normal speakers were about to become the real victims of Johnson's experiment. After careful screening, Tudor selected 22 children between the ages of 5 and 16. 10 of these children already had existing stutters, but 12 of them spoke normally with no speech problems whatsoever. These 12 normal speakers had no idea they were about to become guinea pigs in one of the most unethical experiments in psychological history. Tudor divided the children into 4 groups to test Johnson's diagnosogenic theory. The first group contained stuttering children who would receive positive therapy. They were told their speech was fine and improving. The second group also contained stuttering children, but they received standard speech therapy with normal correction methods. The third group contained normal speakers who received positive reinforcement. They were praised for their good speech and told to keep up the excellent work. But the fourth group was where the real horror began. These were normal-speaking children who were deliberately subjected to psychological abuse disguised as therapy. The children in this fourth group were told they were beginning to stutter. Tudor would stop them mid-sentence and tell them their speech was becoming unclear. She criticized their normal speech patterns and told them they needed to be more careful about how they spoke. She made them believe there was something wrong with their voices, even though they had never had any speech problems before. Week after week, from January to May 1939, Tudor returned to the orphanage. She would pull these children aside and systematically tear down their confidence in their own voices. She told them to think before they spoke, to be careful with their words, to monitor every sound they made. She planted seeds of doubt and fear in their minds about something as basic as talking. The scripts Tudor used were chillingly direct and brutal. She would tell children things like, "You must try to stop yourself immediately," and "Don't ever speak unless you can do it right." Imagine being a young child and having an adult authority figure tell you that your natural way of speaking was wrong and dangerous. Before you ask how we know about this, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what happened next will shock you even more. The results of Johnson's experiment were exactly what he had hoped for, but they were also absolutely devastating. The control groups showed minimal speech changes, just as expected. The stuttering children who received positive therapy improved slightly, while those who received standard therapy showed normal progress. But the experimental groups told a very different story. Of the 6 children in the group who were told they were beginning to stutter, 5 developed serious speech anxieties and ongoing speech problems. These children, who had spoken normally their entire lives, suddenly became afraid to talk. The psychological damage was immediate and severe. Some children became withdrawn and refused to participate in normal activities. One child became so traumatized that he refused to speak at all, even years after the experiment ended. These weren't temporary effects that would fade with time. Johnson and Tudor had created lasting psychological scars in innocent children. The experiment didn't create the biological markers of stuttering that Johnson was looking for, but it did something far worse. It created deep psychological trauma around the simple act of speaking. Children who had never questioned their ability to communicate suddenly became terrified of their own voices. Johnson had proven his theory, but at what cost? He had successfully shown that negative labeling and criticism could create speech problems in normal children. But he had also destroyed the confidence and well-being of vulnerable kids who trusted the adults around them. The most disturbing part of this entire story is what happened next. Johnson never published the results of his experiment. He knew exactly what he had done and how unethical it was. Instead of facing the consequences of his actions, he simply buried the evidence. Tudor's thesis remained hidden away, collecting dust in university archives. The children who had been damaged by the experiment were left to deal with their trauma alone. No one followed up on their progress. No one provided them with therapy to undo the damage. They were simply abandoned once Johnson got the data he needed. For over 60 years, this horrific experiment remained a secret. The story only emerged in 2001 when investigative journalist Jim Dyer of the San Jose Mercury News started digging into the University of Iowa's research history. Dyer uncovered Tudor's thesis and began tracking down the survivors of the experiment. What he found was heartbreaking. Many of the children who had been subjects in the experiment still carried the psychological scars decades later. Some had struggled with speech problems their entire lives. Others had developed deep anxieties around communication that affected their relationships and careers. The survivors were now adults in their 60s and 70s, but they still remembered the fear and confusion they felt as children when Tudor told them their speech was wrong. They remembered being afraid to talk, afraid to express themselves, afraid of their own voices. In 2007, the state of Iowa finally acknowledged what had been done to these children. They agreed to a settlement of $925,000 to compensate the survivors for the emotional harm they had suffered. But money couldn't undo decades of psychological damage or give back the confidence that had been stolen from them as children. The monster study, as it came to be known, dramatically illustrated how labels and negative feedback can cause real psychological and speech issues. Johnson's theory about the environmental causes of stuttering wasn't entirely wrong, but his method of proving it was absolutely inexcusable. Today, the actions taken by Johnson and Tudor are unmistakably unethical and prohibited by law. There was no informed consent from the children or their guardians. The experiment was conducted in secret with deliberate non-disclosure. Most importantly, it involved the deliberate psychological manipulation of vulnerable children for research purposes. The monster study helped cement modern protections for research subjects. The U.S. National Research Act of 1974 established strict guidelines for informed consent and ethical oversight of research involving human subjects. Speech pathology organizations developed specific ethical guidelines to prevent similar abuses. The study also influenced how we treat stuttering today. The now popular LIDCOM program, used to treat preschool stuttering, was intentionally designed to avoid the kind of negative labeling that Johnson used. Modern therapy focuses on positive reinforcement and building confidence rather than criticism and fear. Johnson's famous quote about stuttering beginning in the parent's ear continues to influence how we understand the role of environment in speech development. But we now know that the relationship between environment and stuttering is far more complex than Johnson believed. While some aspects of Johnson's diagnosogenic theory have been partially discredited, the experiment did spark ongoing exploration into the emotional and temperamental components of stuttering. We now understand that anxiety and negative experiences can definitely make stuttering worse, even if they don't necessarily cause it in the first place. The Monster study stands as one of the darkest chapters in psychological research history. It showed how easily scientific authority can be abused and how vulnerable children can be exploited in the name of research. But perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated the incredible power that words have to shape our reality. Johnson proved that telling children their speech was wrong could actually make it wrong. He showed that criticism and negative labeling could create the very problems they claimed to identify. And in doing so, he revealed something fundamental about human psychology that we're still grappling with today. The 12 children who entered that orphanage with perfect speech but left with lifelong trauma paid the ultimate price for Johnson's ambition. Their sacrifice helped establish the ethical standards that protect research subjects today. But one question remains unanswered. How many other monster studies are still buried in university archives, waiting to be discovered?